Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. It's been just over a month since President Lee Jae Myung officially took office, and already diplomatic gears are turning. South Korea is signaling a full return to international engagement after a 6-month vacuum following the impeachment of former President Yoon. Special envoy teams have been dispatched to key global players, including France, UK, India, and the EU, marking a clear departure from the traditional focus of Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo and Moscow. Now, at the same time, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun is reportedly preparing for his first trip to America, aimed at breaking ground on stalled tariff negotiations. With summit diplomacy hanging in the balance and geopolitical tensions still active, many are asking, how is South Korea recalibrating its foreign policy? For more on this, we invite Hannah Kim, Associate Professor at Seogang University's GSIS. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
And also joining us online is Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. Good to see you, Professor.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
So let's start a discussion right away with Professor Kelly. So the Lee Jae Myung administration recently sent special envoys to 3 major countries, France, the UK, and India, as well as the EU, starting July 14th. Now, this marks a shift from previous governments, which traditionally prioritized ties with the US, China, and Japan and Russia. How do you interpret the latest move?
Yeah, I think it's probably the motion, at least of the United States, is almost certainly because of the behavior of Donald Trump towards U.S. allies in the last 6 months. It's not even clear what America's tariff demands are vis-a-vis South Korea, right? Donald Trump has violated not 1 but 2 trade agreements with South Korea, right? So the original course and then the version of course that Trump renegotiated when he was president the first time. And so I think the Koreans are learning what many other U.S. allies are learning, which is that the United States is pretty unreliable at this moment, at least until, Trump gets his act together on this and sort of decides what he wants out of South Korea. And so South Korea is starting to look elsewhere. I think this also aligns, more broadly speaking, with progressive ideology sort of on the South Korean left, which has always kind of looked for alternative relationships outside of the United States, which has seen excessive dependence on the United States as something as sort of neo-colonial or excessively violating South Korean sovereignty. And so shopping around, looking for other players, looking for other countries to trade with, to build relationships with, helps to sort of counterbalance sort of the size of the United States and South Korea's diplomacy, and also the erraticness, for lack of a better word, of the current American government.
Right. So ties with the U.S. have definitely affected South Korea's focus lately. Now, building on that, South Korea went through a roughly 6-month suspension of summit diplomacy following the impeachment of President Yoon. Professor Kim, could this latest round of envoy dispatches be read as a clear sign that Korea is reopening its formal diplomatic channels?
I think it definitely can, as you mentioned, because of the turbulent political climate that the country has been experiencing as a whole over the past 6 to 7 months. And there was a long pause in summit diplomacy, which is very concerning for foreign policy. So now with a new administration in power, the entire country is trying to come back to a sense of normalcy and a return to the status quo. This can be seen through diplomatic engagement, such as the dispatch of special envoys that have already taken place, as we just talked about. So this dispatch can signal many things. For one, it can signal that Korea is trying to reaffirm strategic partnerships by sending special envoys to major global powers. As we talked about earlier, this includes 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council, a critical EU institution, and a rising power such as India. So this dispatch indicates a symbolic re-engagement with the international community and a desire to show that South Korea is still a committed and capable actor despite what's been happening over the past 6 months. And I think it also indicates that the administration is now swiftly preparing for upcoming international summits, trade negotiations, defense dialogues. In general, it's a deliberate effort to reestablish normalcy in foreign relations and rebuild international trust. But at the same time, and as was mentioned earlier as well, the selection of countries that special envoys have been dispatched to is quite interesting. Part of it is, as Professor Kelly mentioned, the Trump effect. I think there's declining trust in the United States, but also I think it indicates that seems to maybe South Korea is broadening its diplomatic base and trying to avoid overdependence among greater powers, possibly put on trying to focus on global middle power networking. And so in many ways, it is an attempt to return to normalcy, but there are some changes that we are already seeing.
Right. So this is definitely a pivotal moment, to restart Korea's diplomatic playbook moving forward. Now, let's touch upon the broader scope now. Professor Kelly, Seoul's presidential office has announced plans to send envoys to as many as 14 countries. How likely could this expanded outreach translate into, tangible economic or security partnerships?
On security, probably not too much, right? South Korea is really, really deeply interwoven with the U.S. military. A lot depends on that. If Donald Trump really turns out to be unreliable, right? If Donald Trump starts talking to South Korea the way he has, say, to Canada, or to Denmark regarding Greenland, if the U.S. becomes that sort of antagonistic, then South Korea's security relationships will open up. But at the moment, I don't think that's the case. I think what it probably really is sort of shopping around for export markets, because traditionally the United States and a few other countries have been near the top, right? China included, and both the U.S. and China are sort of awkward export markets at the moment politically, right? China obviously is an autocracy, right? China is a little bit more belligerent than it was in the past under this president, Xi Jinping. And of course, the United States has become extraordinarily unreliable, right? And so if you're South Korea, 2 of your 3 top trading partners are politically difficult, and so it makes sense to sort of go shopping around. India, for example, is a great choice, right? India is growing now faster per annum than China is, so India is a great place to look for South Korean exports. Persian Gulf states have traditionally been another area. European countries. So it's wise, right? And again, I think it fits in, broadly speaking, with the political priorities of a leftist progressive government in South Korea, which is to avoid over-reliance on the United States and sort of look around and have Korea be more of an independent power, right? Less sort of tied into camps. And again, so if South Korea has many sort of different plates in the air, right, if you will, right, many different sort of relationships moving at one time, that gives South Korea some room to move.
Right, but Professor Kelly, there's still concerns about, this impact could be diluted if too many countries are engaged in one's. What's your stance on that?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, South Korea is a middle power, right? So ultimately, South Korea can't have sort of these major strategic relationships with lots and lots of countries. Ultimately, that's not really going to work. South Korea is going to have to prioritize. Traditionally, in the past, that has meant the United States, Japan, and China, and obviously North Korea strategically, of course. But traditionally, it's been sort of 3, maybe 4 if you want to throw the Europeans in there. But again, 2 of those 3 or 4, the Americans and the Chinese, are politically unreliable. So it makes sense to kind of feel around and see what you can find. Perhaps India would be interested, right? I mean, India is a democracy, which South Korea is, and India is growing pretty rapidly. It could be a good export market for South Korea's manufacturing exports. But yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. In time, South Korea is going to have to reprioritize. You may remember previous governments sort of said, okay, well, now we're going to look south. Southeast Asia was kind of a thing for a little while under Moon Jae-in, and then that kind of faded away, right? I would imagine that you'll see some kind of prioritization, some shakeout in the next 6 to 8 months as these various initiatives come to fruition or not.
Right, so more concentration would be necessary moving forward.
Probably.
Now, let's also narrow in on the U.S. angle, Professor Kim. So just over a month into the new administration, a special envoy to the U.S. was formed, headed by former KCCI Chairman Park Yong-man. So given that a business leader was chosen to represent the administration, could we interpret this as a sign that Korea intends to emphasize economic issues, especially trade and its ties with America?
I think in many ways we can assume that. As you mentioned, Park Yong-man is the former chairman of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So appointing him suggests that the new administration is placing a strategic emphasis on economic diplomacy, particularly in trade, investment, and industrial cooperation. And historically and traditionally, U.S.-ROC relations have been anchored in security, but now we're seeing how economic issues are growing increasingly central to this relationship, to this alliance. And this is especially the case with the tariff issue that we've seen growing recently. The current administration has shown that it's trying to make an all-out effort in its tariff negotiations with the United States, with newly appointed ministers and special presidential envoys traveling to Washington. So we know that this the economic aspect is becoming quite central. But the appointment of Park Yong-man can also suggest that there's a desire to enhance private sector influence in diplomacy since he represents private sector leadership rather than career diplomacy or political affiliation. So this move isn't meant to sideline security, but rather complement it and focus on having a robust economic pillar. So in many ways, it shows that Seoul is trying to match the evolving landscape by focusing more on an economic strategic partnership. But at the same time, Park Yong-man is a seasoned business executive, so he's not technically a career diplomat, and he may lack a bit of the experience in high-level negotiations and nuanced understandings that U.S. political dynamics, or understanding of U.S. political dynamics relative to more experienced politicians. So this could be working a little bit to his disadvantage. So this decision has benefits, and the aim is to focus more on centralizing economic issues, but there are some trade-offs.
Right, definitely. Now, let's move a little bit eastward. So, envoys to China, Japan, and Russia haven't been finalized as of yet. Professor Kelly, these countries involve complex issues tied to history, security, and trade, as we know. Do you think the administration is taking a more cautious, a calculated approach on this?
Yeah, I think so. Regional issues, again, are going to become more important as the American relationship thins or declines, again, assuming Trump behaves here as he has in Europe. And so if the American bond, which traditionally conservative parties really emphasize a lot, if the American bond is in decline because the Trump government just can't make up its mind, if it picks a fight with South Korea over trade, if it demands an enormous amount as a part of the strategic negotiations over U.S. forces Korea, right? If this sort of drives the two sides apart, then South Korea's got to go shopping around. But South Korea's a middle power, right? I mean, South Korea's not going to build some big relationship with Europe or, South America or something. Those places are far away. And so ultimately that means that South Korea is going to need to develop local relationships, right? And this is something that the South Korean left think has really emphasized for a while, right? That South Korea sort of got overly tied to the United States on issues in the region. It was sort of tied into this camp, particularly regarding Taiwan. And I think the current government would like a little bit more space on that, a little bit more room to move regarding China particularly, right? And I think that's what this is intended to do.
Yes, definitely. So a more cautious approach into this complex relationships. Now, Professor Kim, Foreign Minister Cho Hyun officially took office today, and he's reportedly coordinating a visit to the United States. And during his confirmation hearing, he expressed optimism that the Korea-U.S. tariff negotiations could be concluded on time. Do you expect his trip to bring some potential breakthrough for these talks?
I understand the motivation of wanting that breakthrough. I don't know how possible it will be realistically. The goal is to try to break the deadlock over the U.S.-Korea tariff negotiations. And Foreign Minister Cho Hyun is the reason for his visit so soon after taking office indicates the urgency and priority that the U.S.-Korea tariff negotiations have in his agenda and for the administration overall. And his visit carries a diplomatic weight, and it signals that resolving the tariff issue is a top priority for the new administration. In addition to this, Cho Hyun is a seasoned diplomat with extensive experience in multilateral negotiations and economic diplomacy. So he can, it will help bridge gaps where talks have stalled, especially during the past 6 months. So his visit, along with earlier dispatch of economic envoy Park Yong-man, really creates a two-track approach with diplomatic negotiations at both the ministerial level as well as an industry-oriented dialogue. So this can allow for more flexible bargaining. And in this way, Ministers Cho's visit can potentially try to break deadlock, but at the same time, there have been some structural limits on the US side. There's limited flexibility. In addition to this, we've seen the Trump tariffs have become quite embedded in US trade politics. So it's becoming a problem not just for Korea, but for the rest of the world. And it's making them very difficult to remove or even negotiate. And in addition to this, Washington often separates security and economic issues. So despite the strong alliance between the United States and South Korea, that this may not be as effective as South Korea may want it to be. But most importantly, I think that this visit comes way too late in the game. You know, there was already a 6 months pause, and because of this, breaking the deadlock is going to be quite difficult.
Hmm. This is very concerning as because the U.S. tariff deadline is definitely approaching. So taking all these factors into account, Professor Kelly, when do you think is the most realistic timeframe for a U.S.-South Korea summit to actually take place?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, so much that depends on Donald Trump's mercurial personality. I mean, it's just so hard to say because Donald Trump just, he kind of governs by what he sees on television and who talks to him last and stuff like that, right? I mean, I sometimes fear that Korean viewers think the United States is sort of more rationally governed at the moment than it actually is. Um, South Korea is sort of in the middle in terms of sort of the American architecture, right? To the United States, countries like Israel and Britain are more important. Canada is more important, if only because Trump apparently wants to take it over, right? So I would imagine that a summit with South Korea is probably a little far down Donald Trump's list of priorities. I think by the end of the year is pretty heroic. But I do think the South Koreans probably want to push for this in order to facilitate some kind of breakthrough in the trade issue. Again, we don't know how tough the Americans are actually going to play on this, right? I mean, the Koreans actually have sort of law and treaty on their side, right? And we had Chorus, and then we had the revision of Chorus, right? So the whole negotiation itself is sort of not really supposed to even be taking place. But Trump just doesn't care about that stuff, right? Which makes it really, really difficult to actually foresee the utility of a summit because Trump will agree to something and then backtrack on it. I don't know, probably by the end of next year at the latest, but I would be pretty surprised if the South Koreans managed to pull that out of Donald Trump in the next 6 months by the end of the year. I mean, Trump he just doesn't govern that way. He doesn't really have summits very much, and he's sort of pulled into the Ukraine war right now and pulled into the Middle East. I just don't think that Korea is very high on his list of priorities.
Right, so not really likely in the near futures. Now,
Yeah, I think that's great.
So with this uncertain situation on the summit between the U.S. and Korea, there's speculation that a Korea-Japan summit might happen before this. Professor Kim, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it might be possible, especially because, as we've just been talking about, we don't know what decision Trump is going to be making. It is expected that Seoul's first summit destination is expected to be Washington, but there could be a South Korea-Japan summit first because of the timing. It may also have to do with regional proximity and practical urgency. Because of this 6 month pause that we've already had, South Korea needs to urgently address a lot of issues that have been put on hold. And Japan's geographically closer, but it's also a key actor in regional issues such as North Korea's provocations, economic security, supply chain resilience. And so there's immediate coordination is required. Also, since, as we just talked about, because the U.S.-South Korea summit remains unscheduled, it may just take longer. And while waiting, it's possible that a summit between Japan and South Korea may take place. But as we know, with many progressive administrations, it's very likely that progressive administrations focus on resolve historical issues with Japan. So if there were a summit that took place, then it can spark some backlash against the current administration, especially if this takes place first before the United States. So in many ways, it is possible because of practical and regional urgency, but at the same time, it is very important for South Korea to prioritize a U.S. South Korea summit as well.
Now, before we let you go, let's also touch upon summit with China, of course. Lastly, reports say President Lee has decided not to attend China's 80th Victory Day commemoration after deliberation. Professor Kelly, while this may reflect consideration for Korea-U.S. ties, there's also talk of a Korea-China summit during the APEC meetings in Gyeongju this year. What kind of impact do you think this would have on future Seoul-Beijing ties?
Yeah, I think that's probably wise. Again, Korea is a smallish country surrounded by much larger countries, and so it makes sense for Korea to prosecute a vigorous diplomatic strategy and solicit the powers around it, right? It's sort of, Korean history, it's traditionally been sort of bullied by the larger states around it. It's a middle power surrounded by three great powers. That's a pretty tough spot to be in. So it actually makes sense to actually do this. So I would encourage these efforts. China is also a really big export market for South Korea. That's become more important as the Americans have become less and less reliable. Right? Again, I keep banging away at this, but the whole negotiations with the U.S. over trade shouldn't even be happening because all this was nailed down by treaty a few years ago, and Trump's just throwing the rule book out on that, right, which suggests that the United States is going to be an unreliable trading partner, even if a new deal is found. It's not even clear to me that the Americans will stick to it. So it makes sense to go off and talk to China. But I think the big issue in the background, actually, I would argue in China is not trade. We haven't really talked about this, but would be South Korea's position on China's various maritime behavior, its aggressions, if you will, right, which are not just limited to the South China Sea anymore, but now also include the Yellow Sea, where China's begun to put some facilities and stuff like that and has warned off the South Korean Navy. I mean, at some point, South Korea is going to have to start to take a position on Chinese salami slicing, its sort of gray zone tactics all along its naval perimeter, and the South Korean progressives have traditionally tried to sort of avoid entanglement in that mess, right, with sort of lining up with the United States. But I think that's going to be increasingly hard to avoid in the future. And so my guess is that if the two meet, it's not just going to be trade, it's also going to be some of these kinds of issues, particularly those Yellow Sea structures.
Right. So how South Korea would navigate these kinds of issues will definitely define the next chapter of its diplomatic landscape, and we'll be keeping close eyes on that. But as for now, we'll have to wrap up our program at this point. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Professor Kim.
Thank you.
And Professor Kelly, we appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.